The number one sector continues to be technology, and that has been so for the entire 13 years that we've been following this. So despite privacy or any of the other issues you might hear about, don't worry, tech is still number one. The phoenix from the ashes is the auto industry. The auto industry was right at the bottom 5 or 6 years ago, is now the second globally in our trust study. Consumer products tend to be third in the developing markets. This is a good news story for Chicago companies that are in food, business, etc. Now, the disaster story is banks and financial services. Banks and financial services 5 years ago were absolutely at the highest end of trust in industry sector. That trust has basically been destroyed in the developed markets. In the developing markets, fascinating to us, there is 80% plus trust in banks and financial services in China, India, Mexico, etc. In the markets such as Germany, France, the UK, it's under 30% and continues to be such. However, we are calling a bottom. We are calling a bottom for bank trust in 2011 in the United States and in 2012 in Western Europe. Importantly, there's been a doubling of trust in banks in the United States in the last 2 years, from 25 to 50, so halfway back to where they were at their high point as of 2007. Why do banks and financial services have a problem? We did a deep dive this year. Specifically, the first point is performance. There is perceived lack of performance in lending to small business, access to affordable credit cards, mortgages, etc. So in those markets where banks are distrusted, it is generally perceived that they are doing a lousy job. But on top of that, 60% of people believe that the scandals in financial services are caused by a culture of bonuses or corporate corruption. And in fact, there's very widespread knowledge of these scandals, 78% in the UK, 65% in the US. And the worst news of all for all of the rest of us in business is that 2/3 of those we survey believe that the scandals in financial services are now common to all business. I'm going to say that again. 2/3 of the people said that they believe that the scandals in financial services now are prevalent in all business. Therefore, we believe that banking is a trust anchor for all the rest of business. Now, who's trusted as spokespeople? Importantly, we can now confirm that it is either experts with credentials or peers. It is, at the very bottom, CEOs and government leaders. Do you know that in 4/5 of the countries we survey, trust in a government leader is under 50%. It's 2/3 of the countries' trust is of CEOs under 50%. In fact, trust for CEOs is only high in China, India, and Mexico. It's not great. Also, understand that along with this spokesperson issue comes a general skepticism about what you hear, see, or read. In most of the markets we survey, you have to hear, see, or read something 3 to 5 times in different places to confirm that, in fact, it is a truth. Now, when we talk about the crisis of leadership, the dimension of this is that people actually believe their leaders lie. Let's go to the statistics. We asked a specific question. Do you trust a business leader or a government leader to tell the truth, no matter how complicated or unpopular that story is? 18% said they trust a business leader to do that. 13% trust a government leader to do that. Do you trust a business leader or a government leader to make an ethical or moral decision in a difficult situation? 19% said they trust a business leader to do that. 14% said they trust a government leader to do that. So, leaders are liars. But the trust in institutions is rising. How to explain this gap? Basically, we believe that the general sense of improvement in conditions is happening despite leadership. It used to be the opposite way. It used to be that things were better because you had an outstanding leader, and outstanding leaders don't exist today. There's a great cynicism about leadership. There's also a tremendous change in what constitutes trust building. How does a company get forward? Before the Great Recession in 2008, it used to be about financial performance, having a respected CEO, or being in high-ranked among your industry colleagues. That was 75% of what created trust. Today, that's only 38%. That's just table stakes. What builds trust for corporations? Treating employees well is number one. Engaging is two. Integrity is three. Transparency is four. That's the new normal. But business's performance against these expectations is quite poor. When we ask, what do you want and what are you getting? We see 30-point gaps on these aspects of treating employees well, the so-called new normal. So in fact, business is getting a low grade. Out of all this, we'd like to hypothesize that in fact, we now can observe a new model for influence. Many of you, I'm sure, studied C. Wright Mills in college, the pyramid of influence and how information went vertically downwards. And basically, you had to appeal to the few. You could have, in a sense, a virtual kind of communication just to the elites, the opinion formers, and you could control the message. Today, that's over. You now observe, while there is that still, pyramid of authority, you now have an inverted pyramid of community that's part of it. So it looks like a diamond. And in fact, the people on the bottom are communicating horizontally until there's a breakthrough of information into the elites. And in fact, that happens when you have a Facebook organized rebellion against Bank of America for debit card charges, for example. And this is about empowerment, and it's about the dispersion of authority. So it's about the many, it's about co-creation, and it's about vertical and horizontal. So we actually also believe that the leadership model for chief executives has to change. That people who are living in this old world of control and I'll wheel out and talk to the security analyst and wheel back into my office and my press person is going to call the Wall Street Journal and get that great story quoting all the securities analysts, that's over, folks. That is over. We now have to have a new model, and it's called inclusive leadership. You have to absolutely go out there and enlist new voices, employees, social activists, your keen consumers, plus the classic experts. But leaders also have to be grounded. You cannot have imperial leadership anymore. It's not about your position. You don't become a leader just because you have the stripes of CEO on your shoulder. You actually have to act in a different way. You have to build legitimacy by showing humility. You have to share your reasoning and tell people how and why you're going someplace. You have to explain the mutual benefit to the broader community, and you also have to be sure to explain that you're going to be radically transparent, that the world has changed, that we have to show how we're going to do what we're going to do and then measure it. So, in conclusion, first, there's a fundamental reordering of authority, dispersion to experts and to peers, away from the traditional CEO government leader. Doesn't mean that the CEO shouldn't speak or the government leader. You just can't do it alone. Remember, Michael Jordan never won a championship until he had 5 good players around him. The second is the old playbook is not sufficient. Just making the numbers. And God knows, and Randy White and I will remember back to Harvard Business School, you make the numbers, you perform well, you'll be a great CEO. Folks, that's over. That's not going to work anymore. You're only going to get to great performance if you make the numbers. That's true. But you also have to lead in a way that's inclusive. Third, there is a tremendous opportunity here for business. The gap between trust in business and trust in government is the largest we've seen since 2007. But business has to conduct itself differently. And finally, I want to really underline the fragility of trust. What you saw between November and January in the United States is indicative of a fragile situation.